Hi, everyone. François Picard here for a Holy Social Distancing Week edition of The World This Week. The World This Week in partnership with the Daily Beast. The Daily Beast foreign editor Christopher Dickey is with us from the French capital. How are you?
I'm good. I've been looking out the window at what probably is the most beautiful spring day that we've had, and all I see is the windows on the other apartment building.
All right. It's tough to be in the city in confinement, in lockdown. Is it tough to be in lockdown when you're in Rome? The Daily Beast's correspondent at large, based out of the Italian capital, Barbie Lazza-Nadeau, is with us as well. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you for having me. It's very difficult. We're on week 5 here of the lockdown, and it doesn't get any easier.
We're having record high temperatures, by the way, here in Paris today. What's it like where you are?
It's warm. It's got to be at least 27 degrees. People are out on their terraces. People are sitting sunbathing on their balconies, but it's just not quite the same as it should be on a Good Friday before Easter.
All right. Good Friday would not be complete if we didn't go from Rome to Jerusalem. France 24's correspondent in Israel, Iris Mockler, is with us. How are you, Iris?
I'm good. When I hear about these beautiful days, I'm a bit jealous because it's very cold, uncharacteristically cold today. And anyone who is doing any kind of Good Friday activity is really rugged up, which includes a few brave Franciscan monks who did try and do the route they normally do along the Via Dolorosa. But the church is closed, the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, so it was a very truncated experience. Those 3 brave monks did do it.
All right, 3 brave monks. We'll talk more about that in a moment. It was already going to be a Good Friday, unlike many. That's because coincidence of the calendar. You've got Easter and Passover at the same time this year. Ramadan is just around the corner. It begins later this month. Christopher Dickey, we're also coming up to an anniversary, the first anniversary of the fire at Notre Dame Cathedral. They had what was billed as a moment of meditation earlier. The violinist Renaud Capucin was part of that ceremony that took place in Notre Dame with, of course, nobody there from the general public. Your thoughts on Notre Dame, where, by the way, the work on reconstruction of that roof had to be halted, of course, at the end of March.
Yeah, look, it's very sad. I mean, I think probably there are some people who see the destruction of Notre Dame as a kind of an ill omen, the beginning of what's become a terrible 12 months. And the ceremony was taking place in a building that really is far from restored. From the images that we've been able to see from the interior, there are big parts of the roof, virtually all the roof missing, a lot of the stained glass is missing. It looks like a ruin more from the inside than it does from the outside, which is very sad. It's going to be a very, very long project to restore it.
A very long project, and it's also a strange Good Friday in Rome, Barbie Lazza-Nadeau. What with, as we're recording it, it's before that socially distant service that's being held by the Pope later from the Vatican.
That's right. I mean, normally on a Good Friday, you'd already have people lined up to get to the Colosseum so you could see the Pope do the Way of the Cross ceremony. Now, of course, he's going to be alone in St. Peter's Square tonight. We're expecting a very ambient environment with candles and kind of a lone procession that he'll make, but it's nothing like we've ever seen in the city before. The whole weekend, which is generally, the kickoff to the tourist season in Rome, is just an eerie silence across the city. And I think tonight, Good Friday, is really, really going to be atmospheric.
It's going to be atmospheric. Is there a sense where you are, Barbie, that they're beginning perhaps to see the light at the end of the tunnel? This is the country that has been the hardest hit here in Europe by the COVID-19 pandemic.
Well, we were really hoping that the plateau would start to go down now, but it seems we're on a very, very long and steady plateau. The case numbers have absolutely evened out. We've seen the stabilization of that, but we're waiting for the curve to go down now. And, part of the problem is that Italians are not respecting in every corner of this country the lockdown rules. And of course, you've got people moving around, you've got the virus still moving. So, they're really, really worried about this Easter weekend with people defying and breaking the lockdown. We've got helicopters over the city of Rome. I've seen police cars by my house with loudspeakers all morning telling people to get back inside. And, the lockdown has to be, for it to be effective, the lockdown has to be respected. And we're not seeing complete compliance. And this good weather, this beautiful weather makes it harder for a lot of people.
Iris Makler, how are they respecting confinement where you are?
Well, not entirely 100% respect, I'd have to say. We've just had the first night of Passover, in which there was basically a curfew unprecedented on the Jewish population here, forcing people to stay home, forcing them not to see their families. And Israel's Prime Minister said this was a safety measure, that Israel had learnt its lesson from the previous Jewish festival when they hadn't really enforced it. They'd allowed all these parties to go ahead and there was a huge spike in the number of infections. So he said this time nobody is going to see, nobody's going out, and you actually literally couldn't leave the house. And that was the only way they could think, because Passover is such a family festival. And so it was that everybody was celebrating the festival of freedom locked into their houses.
And with the health minister himself being ultra-Orthodox, has the tone changed from the government?
It's quite interesting with the ultra-Orthodox health minister, because there have been accusations that he didn't really follow the instructions of his own department, that he took steps that were against the restrictions, and then he himself became infected with the coronavirus, and as a result, the restrictions here are pretty strict. So they were saying that all the people who had come into contact with him then had to go into isolation. That included the Prime Minister, the head of the Mossad, the head of the National Security Council, all the health officials in charge of this crisis had to go home. He'd been in a television studio the night before. Everybody there had to go home. They were calling him the typhoid Miriam of this crisis.
Your reaction, Christopher Dickey?
Well, I think we've seen this again and again, where people, whether for religious or political motives, decide that they're not going to listen to the social distancing regulations. They're even going to mock them. I mean, the classic case is Boris Johnson, who's still in hospital now after going around in a coronavirus ward and shaking hands with everybody and bragging about it just a couple of weeks ago. So I think everybody knows how serious it is now, but on an individual basis, even among individual politicians, it's hard to make people conform. It's hard to make them radically change their behavior. So I think that's what we're looking at.
It's what we're looking at, and certainly in New York City, the numbers have been sobering. What with more deaths there than anywhere else around the planet now. And, scenes where you even have humanitarian aid coming to New York in the way you would normally expect to see it in the third world. It's a France 24 report read by Jessica Le Mazurier.
A field hospital in the middle of New York's Central Park. It's been set up to care for coronavirus patients. Under these tents, there are 68 beds and 10 respirators, strategically placed just a stone's throw from Mount Sinai, one of the biggest hospitals in Manhattan. Brittany Akinsola is an intensive care nurse. She looks after patients who are in a critical condition.
Normally, whenever I respond in this capacity, it's in another country. I've served in Ecuador, in Haiti, even in Mosul, Iraq, in a war zone setting. I never could have imagined that we would be dealing with something like this right here in America, in our own country, in New York City.
This temporary hospital was set up by an evangelical Christian non-profit called the Samaritan's Purse. The group is against gay marriage and abortion. But the situation is so bad here in New York that the mayor and the governor are taking any help they can get. There's a dire shortage of personal protective gear for healthcare workers, but this field hospital is fully stocked. The doctors and nurses working here are highly qualified.
So we start by putting on our boots, There we also have some face shields that help protect our face. Every single day as a staff, we take our temperature once in the morning and once at night to make sure that we're remaining asymptomatic.
Dozens of patients in a critical condition have been treated here since April 1st when the field hospital opened. With several thousand dead and tens of thousands infected with the virus, New York is at the epicenter of the outbreak here in the United States.
Chris Verdicki, the Daily Beast has been reporting on the paramedics who've been swamped in New York. Your reaction when you watched that report?
Well, my first reaction, frankly, is that it's a lot of grandstanding by a group run by Franklin Graham, who is a very retrograde political figure as well as a religious figure in the United States. I think it's good that it helped when it was set up, and I think maybe they're still taking in some patients there. Other emergency measures have not worked out as well. For instance, the Comfort, the big Navy ship that was there, has taken in very, very few patients. But it's also true that it appears that the number of beds needed, the number of intensive care unit beds needed has declined from what was originally projected. So for instance, I understand that St. John the Divine, which is probably the biggest church in New York City, was supposed to be used as a makeshift hospital. Now plans for that have been scrubbed because it looks like it's not going to be needed. So in that sense, there is some good news.
Some good news, and some beginning to talk about a strategy for deconfinement. Barbie, we were talking earlier about the uncertainty of when that can happen in Italy. Under what conditions, though, do you see it?
Well, the Prime Minister has tried to appease the industries, to say that those are going to be the priority, to try to get these factories back running. We've got even factories like Ferrari, makes, beautiful cars, really, really ready to get back to work. But before they do that, they've got to make sure all the workers are safe. They've got to make sure all of the supply chain coming in is secured. And that takes a lot of time and it takes a lot of money. And so right now they're looking at possibly testing every single person that could be going into a factory, both for active cases and the antibody test. And that's going to be a very lengthy process. Now, they're talking about 3 phases, the kind of the lower risk, those would be the factories in the agricultural sector. Then they're talking about a sort of a second tier where you might be able to go buy a pair of shoes if you make an appointment and everybody's wearing protective gear. Then eventually they're talking about bars, restaurants, and beauty salons and places with places like that. But, dentists are considered to be one of the last things that will open back up. We haven't been able to go to a dentist here except for emergency purposes for 5 weeks now. So there are a lot of services that have just been shuttered up, and it's going to take a long time, and the population is a little bit nervous about it too. We've been locked down for a while, so how do you feel when you might suddenly be able to be free? There's a fear of contagion. There's all sorts of fears. It's scary to get locked down, but it's almost scarier to unlock.
Almost scary to unlock. On that score, Iris Makler, Israel's been cited as this tech-savvy example because talk of apps that will help to enable to show whether or not you're free to go out and about. How's the promise of that looking?
They've already instituted it. For the first time, these technological abilities are being used against the ordinary citizen, a bit like what we heard was going on in Taiwan and South Korea. So they're using technology that they have. If you have the virus, if you're infected, they go back through your phone and they see everybody who is in your vicinity, and they get text messages telling them to go inside too. And that's simply by checking the technology. And they have been doing that. There has been some pushback against it because it is so anti-democratic, because it's so invasive of our privacy. So it has been halted, and there's a court action about it. Of course, Israel doesn't have a government, so all these things are more complicated because it isn't a government committee. There isn't parliamentary oversight. So at the moment, that's on hold, but I think it's going to be to resume.
And if it's complicated in Israel, how is it in the Palestinian territories?
It's been quite interesting to watch the Palestinian reaction. They have been very careful about this. They haven't used that technology in the same way, but they have been very quick to shut things down. It was pilgrims who brought the disease into the Palestinian territories, and town after town was shut. You know, today, when it's been raining, someone did go to the Al-Aqsa compound and all you could hear was the sound of rain, not one person praying. And that's a Palestinian decision. That's the Waqf made that decision. It's not an Israeli government decision on its own. You know, that's something that's been done by the Palestinians and the Muslims who want to pray at that mosque but also want to be safe.
We also want to be safe. And of course, for now, pilgrimages to Mecca are off ahead of the start of Ramadan. We're getting these reports of the Saudi royal family. The New York Times had reporting earlier this week that many there have been afflicted or could be afflicted by COVID-19. Christopher Dickey, some saying there's even a silver lining, what with perhaps a suspension of the hostilities in Yemen.
Well, I think that sort of pestilence and war have finally persuaded the Saudis that they need to re-examine some of the policies that were adopted by Mohammed bin Salman. I think that the case with the royals is probably not as dramatic as the New York Times sources suggested. The people I've been talking to, including one very senior prince, say that about 20 members of the royal family are known to have gotten COVID-19 infections. And it is true also that Saudi Arabia was one of the quickest countries to react. Before there was a single case of known proven COVID-19, they were starting to shut things down. They haven't canceled the Hajj yet, but they probably will. And they have canceled the lesser pilgrimages that take place during the course of the year. So I think, you know, it's probably not appropriate to say about Saudi that they've gotten religion on this, but I think that they have come to understand that they had to take drastic measures to protect their own population, and that the war in Yemen, which has gone on for 5 years and has created the greatest humanitarian disaster in the world, has to come to an end. And that if it continues, Yemen will also become, right on their doorstep, a huge hotbed of the coronavirus pandemic. Right now, I think there are no cases registered there, but that's only because they're not testing anybody.
So another silver lining that we got in the last couple of days came out of the UK. What with Boris Johnson moved out of intensive care, there had been a lot of concern when the Prime Minister had to forego his duties completely over the weekend and check into hospital. As an Australian, Iris Makler, I know you're technically a subject of Her Gracious Majesty the Queen. Your thoughts on what has been going down in the UK?
I tell you what really struck me was how extraordinary foolhardy he personally was. Admitting to first of all, shaking hands, then admitting to it, even boasting about it, really, as if he didn't understand the crisis. And when I've been reading, there was an excellent Reuters investigation of all this, the medicine, what the emails going backwards and forwards between the government and the scientists. It seems to me that they were winging it. And that's the feeling that you have when you look at it. They didn't really understand what this pandemic meant. Perhaps they were too taken up with Brexit. The one thing they did think they understood their big political victory, and they just took their eye off the ball. And by the time they brought it back, they're in a very bad condition, a very bad situation. And it took the Queen, by the way, didn't it? It took that statement from the Queen, one of only 4 she's given outside of her usual Christmas greetings, Christmas broadcasts. You know, that was a very moving thing for people of a certain generation, and I think actually for all the Brits. Not all, of course, but I think generally people did find it reassuring.
And not just the Brits. Barbie Latza Nadeau, I don't know what it was like in Italy, but here in Republican France, people were gushing about the Queen after she gave that speech.
Oh, absolutely. Here too. You know, everybody was talking about it, kind of looking for that sort of leadership here. The closest thing, of course, we have to that sort of figure is the Pope, who hasn't given that kind of statement yet. But people here, I think, love their secret closet royalists, and we're really happy to see the Queen kind of speak for all of Europe. It felt like even as they're no longer part of Europe.
Speaking in the name of Europe, you agree with that, Christopher Dickey?
Yeah, I think that people felt that way. You know, the Boris Johnsons of this world have created a lot of acrimony with Europe, a lot of hostility toward Europe, but Europe doesn't feel that much hostility toward Great Britain, and particularly doesn't feel that much hostility toward Queen Elizabeth. I mean, people remember, the older people, the older generation remember her from World War II and its aftermath. And the younger generation, you know, thinks she's a really nice old lady who's saying distinguished things and reasonable things at a time of crisis, which is not what they're hearing from a lot of politicians.
All right. There was other news, and it's tough. I know it's been tough to speak about anything other than COVID-19 under these unprecedented circumstances. One of the stories, though, that struck us this week, and Iris Mockler, perhaps you can explain, was Cardinal Pell, the highest-ranking member, the former number 3 of the Catholic Church, who is convicted by a jury, convicted on appeal, and cleared by a high court.
It's almost incomprehensible, isn't it? And it depends, of course, where you stand. I've just heard a Catholic lawyer explaining it and saying it was outrageous that it got that far and the High Court undid a terrible wrong. So I guess it depends where you stand, what you see. But there's been an extraordinary reaction inside Australia to this. It was a technicality. What the High Court said was that when you looked at the evidence that the jury looked at, that no properly directed jury could have come to the conclusion it came to because some of the evidence was confusing. I actually found that confusing.
And just to be clear for our viewers, the case was based on the testimony of two victims, or 2 alleged victims, if you will, from the 1990s, who said they'd been abused by Cardinal Pell, one of whom is still alive.
And he was the only person to give evidence, you know, of the actual events of that day, who knew or alleged what had happened, because the other choir boy, they were both then choir boys, the other choir boy had died, and Cardinal Pell didn't give evidence himself. So this now man in his 30s did give evidence. He was cross-examined for, I think, 2 days in the witness box. And so it wasn't even he said, it was just one man's account. And then all the people around who said it couldn't possibly have happened. This is what we usually did. This is how we did it. But we didn't hear from Pell himself. And I think that certainly weighed in the minds of the jury. And that choir boy, the 30-odd-year-old now, it seems compelling. He must have been, because in the end, they believed him. And what the High Court is saying, looking at all the evidence that was before them, that they shouldn't have believed him. They should have believed other people who were saying it was about timing, that it was unlikely that Cardinal Pell would have done that, because he normally did a walk around a procession and then he greeted parishioners. So where would he have found the time to run off to take these alleged actions? So that's what the High Court said. But if you're sitting in Australia and you are a victim of child abuse, and it's historical child abuse, so it's much harder to prove, then it really is your word against mine, then I think those people today are feeling very disappointed. I've been reading online people saying that the reaction of the Pope, who was basically welcoming Cardinal Pell back into the fold without mentioning his name, that it's some Catholics are saying they're going to leave the church over this.
Barbie Latza-Nadeau, you wrote a story about this week. The church quick to bring him back in the fold.
Well, they were very, very, very slow to even acknowledge that he was on trial for clerical sex abuse, historic clerical sex abuse, when it happened. You know, he had diplomatic immunity here in Rome. He lived inside the Vatican city walls. He has a passport. He could have easily stayed there. Only when there was so much pressure by the Australian court system did he leave Rome to go stand trial. But he was never stripped of his collar. He was never stripped of his diplomatic immunity even. And we kind of expect that we'll see him once the coronavirus pandemic calms down. We expect to see him back in Rome, where he will probably be welcomed with open arms within that inner circle of the Vatican City. He was number 3 here. He was the Secretariat for the Economy, a very high-ranking position. He's, of course, been replaced, and only because his mandate had expired, not because the Pope removed him. But I think that there would be no one who would be surprised if we see Cardinal Pell on the streets of Rome when all of this is over.
All right. When we look at confinement and we say that the one story has dominated all, it's also because, well, everything else has shut down. Last weekend, they ran a virtual edition using algorithms of Britain's Grand National Steeplechase horse race. There have been simulations of what basketball competitions could look like. And really summing up the mood, if you will, was BBC sportscaster Andrew Cotter when he posted this to Twitter.
20 seconds to go now. Olive closing in on victory and that coveted prize of being told she's a very good dog. One paw to control and a switch. Now Mabel sensing this might be a chance, still waiting, still believing. And you wonder what Olive is doing here, only has to hold on. Going to the upright though, high tariff with no opposable thumbs, high risk at this stage. And it's gone and Mabel takes it. No mercy from the younger dog, who takes this victory just as time runs out. A famous win built on patience and sheer belief. For Olive, only thoughts of what might have been, but only herself to blame. She's given this one away, and that will hurt most of all. Bad dog.
Bad dog, Christopher Dickey.
That's hilarious. What can I say? I'm sure everybody watching it is laughing. It's absolutely hilarious.
But you as a great sports fan, you must be missing it too.
You're being ironic. You know, I don't follow any sports.
So for you, this confinement is okay.
Yeah, in that sense, it's fine. Although I wish I had two dogs like that. That would be even better.
Barbie Lazzanado, how are the tifosi in Italy managing without football?
Well, you know, they've been on some of the various channels playing old matches. And I think a lot of people just aren't quite as excited about those. But, you know, some of those famous World Cup matches and things like that, you know, I live in a neighborhood where it's really basically the center for the Roma fans. And every time that you hear soccer on, you can tell who's winning by the noise people are making out of their windows. And, you know, we're just not quite getting that same reception on these old matches that we already know the outcome to. But I think people be really ready to get back to their sporting events. Their sports fans are dying for something to watch on TV.
Well, I the other day, I confess, I watched France-West Germany from the 1982 World Cup, and it's still painful. Iris Makler, of course, you have the antidote to all this, and we've seen a lot of it, especially in this holiday week, where I've seen lots of people posting pictures of their cooking. There's been a lot of confinement cooking. You wrote a cookbook last year, recipes handed down by Holocaust survivors to their grandchildren. Have you felt it around you, this return to the kitchen?
I sure have. People who don't, on my Facebook feed, for example, my friends who never cook are all baking bread. I've seen 3 separate people posting the most beautiful sourdough loaves. So when journalists are cooking sourdough loaves and they've never done it before, you know that it's definitely confinement cooking. I do a blog post that follows on from my book, Just Add Love, and the blog post has the same name, and one of the most popular posts that I've done is one that I just did a couple of weeks ago about the lockdown larder. You know, what do you have to have in your home so you can cook? Because really at this time, I mean, in Jerusalem, it's very hard to get food in at all anymore. But even if you could, do you want it delivered? Do you want someone else cooking your food right now? Do you want to pay for it? So all those things make people return to the cupboard, open it, and see what they can make themselves.
Have you become more ambitious on that score, Christopher Dickey?
I haven't, but my wife has. She's been doing a great job. In fact, my mother-in-law is here with us. She's 96 years old, and she says we eat every day as if it's the holidays because the meals are so elaborate and so delicious. And it's a great way of taking up time, even if you're busy, and my wife's very busy teaching online. You wind up with a situation where that's kind of such a soothing thing to do, to cook. And it's such an enjoyable thing in the evening, especially if you have a couple of glasses of wine with the meal.
A couple of glasses of wine, a must for many. Barbie Lazzanado, have you been cooking more?
Well, I have an 18-year-old son at home who would love to be doing anything but staying home, locked down with his mom on his senior year of high school, ready to, he's wondering if he's going to go to college next year. He's wondering if he's going to get to graduate. So I've been making a lot of comfort foods, which are usually desserts and sweet things, just to keep him happy.
Just to keep him happy. Okay. So you've been baking. Gosh, Iris, among the recipes on your blog, leek fritters. Tell us about that.
Leek fritters is the Sephardi Jewish kitchen's Passover dish. Perhaps it's the answer to the traditional Ashkenazi Jewish potato fritters that most people know and would associate with the Jewish kitchen. It's super tasty, and this one came from a grandmother based here. When I say based here, she lives here in Israel. She's a really fine cook, and she Yotam Ottolenghi, the celebrity chef, does a version of these leek fritters too, but he fries the leeks and then fries the fritter. She doesn't have any of that. She poaches the leeks, then fries the fritter. So it's both healthier, and I'm afraid she wins. This is even better than Ottolenghi's.
I was going to say low cal, no doubt.
Not so low cal, but I will say this: when you cook yourself, you know exactly how much of everything you're putting in. You know how much butter there is in your cake. You know how much oil you're using, and that actually stops you sometimes on some levels. You might think, I won't prepare that, I will prepare this. Whereas if you just go and buy it, you don't have that calculus in your head. I think if you cook yourself, it's just healthier.
All right, we'll leave on those words, because after confinement, some will be measuring their waistlines. I want to thank Iris Makler for joining us from Jerusalem. I want to thank Barbie Latza-Nadeau for being with us from Rome. Chris Radicki here in Paris. And if you want, you can continue the conversation with us on Facebook, YouTube, and on France24.com.